Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Sengoku Jidai Part 6, The Campaign of Sekigahara by Extra History. So, last time we saw how Toyotomi Hideyoshi finally unified Japan. He continued the mission of Oda Nobunaga. But, as Toyotomi neared the end of his life, a couple of failed invasions of Korea weakened his position. In contrast, the position of Tokugawa Ieyasu was strengthened because he didn't have to send his men on these invasions. So I imagine in this video we will see the rise of Tokugawa Ieyasu, who has been an important power player throughout this series, but this might finally be his time to shine. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this episode, I would appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked in the description down below, and will give you access to a variety of exclusive content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
At last, the Sengoku Jidai nears its close, but not without one final grand chapter. The year is 1598. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the second great unifier of Japan, has just died.
Wow. He had achieved a lot, as they said. A great unifier of Japan. He had really continued the mission that Oda Nobunaga had started. But in his later years in the 1590s, his invasions of Korea, though, as we talked about last time, you can understand why he took that course of action, they did not end well, and left him in a weakened position.
Leaving a council of 5 regents to guard his young son until he becomes of age to rule.
And isn't it funny? You know, that is a weak position to be in, but after Oda Nobunaga died, the men of the clan, including Toyotomi Hideyoshi, chose a toddler to be his successor so that they could pull the strings behind the scenes. And now, following the death of Toyotomi, we see a sort of similar situation, which I imagine will give an opening to Tokugawa Ieyasu.
By far the greatest of these regents is Tokugawa Ieyasu. His
Yup.
wealth is nearly that of the other regents combined.
Whoa.
Hideyoshi, before his death, set in place a number of edicts to try and keep Japan from descending back into chaos, and to ensure the survival of his 5-year-old son.
Yeah, I mean, look, so far, this mission to unify Japan has been a struggle. Every step of the way, it's threatened to crumble apart. Now, under the strong leadership of Oda Nobunaga, he made a lot of strides toward this goal. After his death, it looked like everything could crumble, but then Toyotomi took over the mission. Now, after the death of Toyotomi, there's a risk that everything once again falls into chaos, and so he's trying to prevent that from happening. Now, one possibility is that maybe power goes to his son, and the regency, the regents surrounding his son, rule effectively. Another course of action is that one of these powerful warlords, maybe, Tokugawa Ieyasu, sort of seizes control and rules in his own right. I'm not exactly sure, but I guess we'll see if everything does fall back into chaos.
But loyalties are deeply divided, and suspicion starts to split the country almost as soon as he's gone.
Yep.
Some daimyo are still pretty bitter over the failed Korean campaign initiated by Hideyoshi, and so, quietly, where few can hear, they whisper their support for the idea of a Japan ruled by a Tokugawa rather than by the son of this peasant who cost them so much.
Wow.
Others fear the Tokugawa's growing power. If he's not stopped soon, he may well become unstoppable. Still others see the instability of having a minor as a successor to the shogunate as a chance for advancement. Mightn't it be possible at this 11th hour for them to swoop in and somehow take the grand prize, all of Japan?
And, you know, Japan has seen more stability under Nobunaga and under Toyotomi than it has for a long, long time. And that might seem a little funny to say, because both of those men spent almost their whole time in power fighting against rivals, but when you see the chaos of the era before, you sort of understand that statement. But even that relative stability threatens to fall apart. We see all of these rivalries emerging. People want to grab power. People are splitting off. Well, I support this leader. I support this leader. I guess we'll see.
One of those in this latter category was a man named Ishida Mitsunari. Ishida was a courtier and not a warrior. He had served Hideyoshi as an administrator, reporting to him on the state of the Korean campaign, and was famously skilled at finance.
Ooh.
As Ieyasu continued to consolidate his power, often ignoring Hideyoshi's provisions against strategic marriages and hostage exchange, Ishida Mitsunari began to plot against him. He planned to have Tokugawa assassinated and came up with the perfect scheme. He would make it seem like the Maeda, one of the other powerful clans on the Council of Regents, was in on the plot, so that even if his assassination plan was discovered, the Maeda would be implicated and forced onto his side. Unfortunately, his plan backfired. Tokugawa had used his wealth wisely and had...
Look, even the smartest of plans can end up backfiring in disastrous ways. That plan sounded pretty intelligent to me. You know, even if it doesn't work, then, well, it's not my fault. It was them who did it. But I guess Ieyasu has a lot of allies, has a lot of power, and it is very dangerous to go after someone like that.
Many people at all levels of society in his debt. He not only found out about the plot and the fact that the Maeda were falsely implicated, but also had a trusty Maeda retainer inform the head of the Maeda clan about exactly what was going on. As one of his final acts, the aging Maeda clan leader, Maeda Toshiie, traveled to see Tokugawa personally to pledge his loyalty.
Wow.
Shortly thereafter, Maeda Toshiie died, and at his funeral, a number of Tokugawa generals planned to have Ishida killed, but Ishida fled to Ieyasu himself and begged for mercy. Strangely enough, Tokugawa granted it, probably deciding that it was better to have an enemy you knew rather than one that you didn't. Besides, if he had Ishida killed now, some other force would certainly arise to oppose Tokugawa in the Sengoku Japan. After being released, though, Ishida continued his scheming.
Oh my goodness, this guy can't help himself. I guess I understand that. I don't know. If I was Tokugawa, I would think it was too dangerous to keep this guy alive. Maybe he was thinking, well, he is pretty skilled at finances. Maybe he can be an important ally. But clearly, this man just can't help himself.
He began to gather as many allies as he could, knowing that a final conflict with Tokugawa was inevitable. In 1600, that conflict began. Uesugi Kagekatsu, Uesugi Kenshin's heir, came storming into Tokugawa land from the northeast, while Ishida started to move his forces up from the west. But Tokugawa had allies of his own. In the last calm days before the war, Tokugawa had made a visit to a lifelong friend, one Torii Mototada, a man he had known since they both served as hostages to the Imigawa way back at the beginning of our tale. They sat and drank sake and discussed the coming war. Tokugawa mentioned that the castle Mototada held was likely going to be one of the first points hit by the enemy, as it stood between them and Kyoto. Mototada acknowledged this, and said that he understood it would be the last time they drank together. They both knew that Mototada and his garrison couldn't possibly hold out. Mototada did not ask to leave or for reinforcements. Instead, he said he'd sell his life dearly, and that he did.
Brave actions. Very brave actions to take. And look, these men are survivors. Tokugawa in particular, we've seen his story. We've seen how a lot of these men, when they were younger, served as hostages in this clan system. It was a pretty common thing. You take the heir of one clan as a hostage, and maybe you can use that as leverage. All of this experience, serving as hostages, fighting all of these wars, being a leader, like I said, a lot of these men, Tokugawa in particular, are absolute hard-as-nails survivors. They will do whatever it takes to not only survive, but achieve their goals.
When the attack finally came, his 2,000 men held out for 10 days against the onslaught of 40,000 Ishida troops.
Whoa.
The castle itself wasn't breached until only 10 of Mototada's men remained. The entire garrison died there, but they took a heavy toll on the anti-Tokugawa forces.
Yeah. And look, when you're defending a stronghold, of course you need far less men than those who are besieging the stronghold. But what we've seen throughout this series is that really only a very small amount of samurai can make a massive, massive impact. I mean, we've seen examples of groups of samurai. You know, we're talking only a couple hundred, 100, less than 100, a few dozen. You know, groups of men, incredibly small, hold out against armies of men, thousands strong. Perhaps not winning, but holding them off for an incredible amount of time. You know, really, one samurai seems to have had an incredible amount of worth. You know, worth a lot of, I suppose you could say, average foot soldiers.
And the 10 days they held fast against the Ishida contingent of the army significantly delayed their march to Kyoto, which would prove crucial to Tokugawa in the end. Thanks to Mototada's sacrifice, forces loyal to the Tokugawa had time to rally and throw back the Uesugi, leaving Ishida to face Ieyasu alone. The decisive conflict came at a place called Sekigahara, a river valley surrounded by hills. The forces were nearly evenly matched, at roughly 80,000 men each.
Wow, we are talking about some massive armies here. I gotta say, I'm frequently surprised at the number of men that these clans are able to marshal. Now, I will say, at this point, we have seen a real centralization of power. I mean, Toyotomi really centralized power, and I imagine that has continued. We're not necessarily seeing one clan versus another. We're seeing a lot of allies coming together. So maybe the number of 80,000 makes a little bit more sense when you keep that in mind, but that is still an incredible amount of men to muster. I think especially considering, not that I know the population of Japan at this point, but Japan's an island nation. There's only so many men you can draw from, you know what I mean? I mean, you go to neighboring China, and we find absolutely gigantic armies there, but they have an absolutely gigantic population. I imagine the percentage of men being mobilized in a lot of this warfare during the Sengoku Jidai must have been a fairly high percentage of the available men.
The Ishida had taken a strong defensive position on the west side of the valley, using the streams and hills to secure their line. The ground was a mire from the driving rains of the night before, and a thick fog shrouded the battlefield. But as the sun rose on October 21st, 1600, and the fog began to clear, the armies engaged. It was a grinding fight, neither side breaking, neither side losing ground or exposing a flank. Slowly, though, as the sun approached its zenith, the Tokugawa forces on the south began to give way. Things weren't going perfectly for Ishida either, though. Some of his forces weren't responding to his commands, and he'd gotten some pushback on a few of his orders for pretty minor reasons. But the fight was still going his way, so at last he decided to signal a full charge into the now exposed southern flank of the Tokugawa. He shot a flaming arrow into the air to signal the all-out assault. But something odd happened. The 16,000 men commanded by one Kobayakawa Hideaki didn't move. From the outset of the battle, those...
Wow, we're seeing another betrayal. Of course, earlier in the series, we saw the betrayal of Oda Nobunaga. That was more a direct turn on your master and murder him type deal. But this is just as bad a betrayal. I mean, when you're in this position, being a clan leader, I'm sure you're absolutely reliant on your subordinates to bring their men to battle. And when you're in the battle, to actually perform. To have this sort of betrayal, that is absolutely ruinous to your chances of victory.
Troops had just sat there, atop a hill at the very southern end of the Ishida line. Commanders from both sides had watched them nervously the entire time, with their flags planted and their men lined up on the southern rise, perfectly still. Frantic Ishida messengers had been sent up there all day demanding that they move, or at least trying to understand what was going on and why they weren't moving, but the messengers were simply turned away. Then, at noon, to the sound of a thundering volley from the Tokugawa arquebusiers, the Kobayakawa troops charged down the hill and slammed into the southern end of the Ishida line.
Okay, would you look at that? So it is that kind of betrayal. Not only is it a, we're not going to get involved in this battle, we're leaving you on your own, but at a certain point they decided, yeah, we're going to turn on our own clan, and we're going straight in. I wonder why in particular that decision was made, because it looks like, you know, the Usagi could have won against Tokugawa, but now I imagine it's going to go in the other direction.
Let me give you a little backstory here. The Kobayakawa were a bit of...
Great, backstory. That is exactly what I was just asking for.
A wild card in this battle from the beginning, and no one on either side knew for sure what they would do. Ishida had promised great rewards to Kobayakawa Hideaki, and brought him on his side. Heck, Kobayakawa had already fought for him in a previous siege. But Kobayakawa had promised his loyalties to the Tokugawa as well. You see, during the Korean campaign years ago, Ishida...
Interesting. This is a little bit more complicated than I initially thought.
Ishida had accused Kobayakawa of recklessness, and Hideyoshi had taken away much of Kobayakawa's lands based on that charge, only to have them later restored when Tokugawa intervened. Turns out that Kobayakawa was still pretty pissed about that, and in the end, his seething resentment of Ishida won out over his desire for a grand reward. And so, as his forces came...
Interesting. So, it actually seems like it was less of a sort of thought-out political decision, though I'm sure it was still that, and more of a spiteful emotional charge. Interesting way to make your decision, though. Like I said, I'm sure it was both. He seems like he was pretty furious, but he must have saw some benefit in siding with Tokugawa. Maybe he thought that was the right way to go. Maybe he thought that he could find a better position under Tokugawa. I'm not sure, but there must have been some logic to it as well.
Came barreling into the Ishida line. Everyone knew what this meant. This defection was the end. It triggered defections from the other wavering commanders and collapsed the Ishida southern flank.
Wow.
In a few hours, there was nothing left of the Ishida forces. The last great army between Tokugawa and complete control of Japan was shattered and broken, their commanders dead or being hunted down before the year's end. With this, Tokugawa started redistributing land throughout Japan, granting wealth to those who had been loyal to him and disempowering those who'd opposed him. In 1603, the emperor granted him the title of shogun, and he ruled happily as shogun for about 2 more years. Yep, that's right. After all that, he was officially shogun for 2 years. But unlike everybody else, this wasn't because he died or lost a battle. It was because he retired. And this may be one of the most important things Tokugawa ever does.
Yeah, retiring. That was not something that you could do during the era of warring states. Retirement? No, no, no. You're gonna fight until your death. But it appears, now that we've hit the 17th century, we've hit 1600, we're moving past that era. Japan is finally becoming unified, basically. We have a more stable administration, at least than Japan has had for about, I think, a century, perhaps more than a century prior. So much chaos, bloodshed, warfare. And it's interesting to see how it's happened. I mean, really, Nobunaga started pushing for this unification to happen, and he laid a lot of the groundwork. Then Toyotomi Hideyoshi picked up where he left off, and then Tokugawa Ieyasu took the mission to its fullest extent, basically.
He continued to rule safe in his home province for the rest of his days, but officially he passed the title of shogun to one of his adult sons, Tokugawa Hidetada, and gave him a fair amount of responsibility in managing the bureaucratic organization of the shogunate. Because Hidetada was an adult who already had a strong military record, and because he ruled in name, and even in part, in fact, for over a decade before Ieyasu died, no one opposed his continued rule when Ieyasu passed.
Yeah, and that is a very good way to have stable succession. Now, we've talked about succession throughout this series, about how it can cause a lot of problems. We talked about it after Nobunaga died, we talked about it after Toyotomi died, and I've used references to a lot of different examples. You know, this is true whether we're talking about a clan system, a shogunate, a monarchical system. If you are someone in power and you die without a clear successor or with a weak successor, that can cause a lot of problems and a lot of chaos. What Tokugawa Ieyasu has done is that he's put one of his sons in charge while he was still around, so that if anyone challenges his son, Ieyasu himself can pop up and go, that's not gonna happen. And so when Tokugawa Ieyasu eventually dies, his son, his family, is already in that position of power, and they've already been in that position for years and years and years, and they have legitimacy, and it becomes a lot harder to challenge the Tokugawa family position.
There would be no upheavals like those that followed the deaths of Nobunaga and Hideyoshi. By retiring early, Ieyasu saw to that.
We see a lot of examples of this, well, throughout history, but you can think of, say, the Roman Empire. A lot of Roman emperors, especially later in the existence of the empire, you can think about the late Western Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire, would appoint their children as co-emperors while they were still alive, so that their son would get years of experience ruling and would also be able to build up that legitimacy, same idea, so that once the father is gone, the son can continue to rule and hopefully not face too many challenges to his reign. Now, this can be done successfully or unsuccessfully. One of the key points is that the son that you appoint to that position actually has to be good at it. In this case, it seems like he was.
This left only one piece that could possibly disrupt the succession of Tokugawas as undisputed rulers of Japan, and that was Hideyoshi's son, Hideyori.
Oh.
So every year, Tokugawa tried to lure him out of his stronghold at Osaka Castle, and every year he refused. Until, at last, Tokugawa just attacked him on the flimsiest of pretenses, an inscription that he'd put on a bell, which, if you really stretched its interpretation, could be considered an insult to the Tokugawa. Kind of. The siege of Osaka began in November of 1614.
Wow, it's finally coming to an end, huh?
By the late spring of 1615, the castle had fallen, and with it, the only Toyotomi heir.
Wow.
It was a year later, almost to the day, that Tokugawa Ieyasu died, and the country passed peacefully into the hands of his son, Tokugawa Hidetada. And like that, the period of the warring states, the Sengoku Jidai, came to an end.
How about that? That was a really interesting series. I got to learn a bit about something that I basically knew nothing about before this. It was really fascinating to learn about the Sengoku Jidai. And it makes me want to learn about more Japanese history, to be honest with you. I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to do this series was to see how it set Japan up for its future. And now I'm like, well, we reached the early 1600s, let's go from there. So, I would ask you guys if you have any other recommendations for Japanese history in particular, or East Asian history more generally. I'd be very interested to hear what they are. We are going to do a series on the Imjin War, those Japanese invasions of Korea, so stay tuned for that. In fact, hey, subscribe, hit that bell. That will let you know when new uploads are released. We'll be doing that Imjin series sometime soon, but I would very much like to do more history in this region of the world, you know? I said this when we started this series. I've been trying to fill in some of the historical gaps I have, some things I don't necessarily know about, trying to expand the range of content we cover on this channel. And I think this is a great place to start, and I would like to continue from here. So yeah, great time with this series. Extra History always does a fantastic job. I hope you guys also had a great time with this series. I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.